Collection of talks on Nokodemion's teaching from Contact Reports 600s, Part 3 to 3.
Contact Report 664.
But it doesn't really matter what good or bad things have been, because the only thing that has always been important to me is that I have learned something from everything and have been able to use the valuable things in my life, as well as for the good of my fellow human beings and for my work. So I'm satisfied with my life, and if I could live it again, then I would not change anything at all, but would live through all the ups and downs again, including all those things, events and situations, etc., that have caused me much misery, distress, and pain. Everything was my lived purpose in life, all the good things that made me happy, while much evil threw me into deep abysses, from which I had to crawl up again laboriously and often with pain and agony. But I have always mastered both forms of experiencing things, events and situations in the end, even if often only laboriously survived. But I have always managed it, because I am never despondent, but always looked forward and told myself that everything can be created and accomplished, if you only tell yourself and are sure that it is really possible. So I was always aware that there must never be any hesitation, no matter what and how it is, because only because of the clear view in relation to looking forward and the effective and unswerving going forward, everything leads to success and to the appointed determination point, which, however, is not simply an end point, but at the same time also a new starting point, which continues and again requires an end point. If it is reached again, becomes again a new starting point, etc., etc. To give up something that one has undertaken to do and achieve in a good framework, that means nothing more and nothing less than a self-abandonment, and thus a failure of oneself. In order to avoid this, I learned very early on from Svath, your father, that important things have to be considered, which I want to do as follows. On the way to success, it must always be the case that important things are never forgotten, that the destination is never lost out of one's senses, and that doubts do not blur. Surrender is not and must never be a solution. Care must also be taken to ensure that strict motivation is always maintained and therefore remains active. However, this must not give rise to any passion, because such a passion can lead to fanaticism, which is extremely detrimental to personal development and sooner or later in some way leads to failure. So also the necessary knowledge must be available, therefore everything necessary must be learned in this regard. This also means that, in order to lead a successful life in the long term and to achieve the set destinations or goals, all tasks, stamina, thoughts and feelings, topics and a minimum motivation must always be present in order to achieve what is aimed for as a concrete goal. On the way to success, it must not happen that some important aspects and things are forgotten, and the final destination is blurred by fears, alotria, inattentiveness, displeasure and doubt, etc., and is no longer fully perceived, and consequently no longer pursued. So especially in these points it must not happen that thoughts, feelings and inclinations arise in such a way that everything that has been positively done suddenly gives up, simply throws in the pimple, or perhaps simply postpones the whole thing of striving to a later point in time. If this is done, then in any case, the result will be that wrong decisions will be made and the set destination or simply the set goal will not be reached. There are certain and plausible reasons for the fact that a positive and valuable destination once set must absolutely be striven for in such a way that it is also achieved with bravura, which I will summarize in the following points. 1. The human being must always know why he is starting something positive, so he must see a clear, positive, and valuable meaning in his whole project. He must remember this meaning and always hold on to it with all his strength when suggestions of thoughts and feelings come to give up the whole thing that has been done. Again and again, it must be brought to mind why the whole thing was started at all and what basic purpose it should serve. It is also necessary to think back to the fact that once there was a time of clear thoughts and feelings in which there was complete certainty for the desired destination of attainment, that this set goal would be implemented and achieved through the process of the entire implementation. So it is also necessary to remember these thoughts and feelings and their intentions, whereby the certainty remains or renews itself again and again. Success is not simply a test, but the achievement of a set goal, which must be achieved, or an accomplished destination, which must be striven for and achieved through all highs and lows. Striving must become the indisputable rule, because only in this way can the whole exist, and man must also be prepared to let himself be guided by what he has set out to do, and to persevere until he achieves what must be the positive end result. 2. When a person strives for something positive and valuable, he must always remember that he can help himself on the one hand, and his fellow human beings on the other hand, and give support in many respects. If man is to succeed, he must not only improve himself, his behavior, his actions, and the execution of his deeds, but also his life. And only when he does so, does he improve his personal environment, especially and first and foremost that which affects his family and those otherwise close to him, as well as the environment in which his friends and acquaintances move. But the external environment is also influenced positively and well by it, because its entire behavior and its good and positive thoughts, feelings and behaviors as well as its actions and deeds penetrate out into the world and to many fellow human beings, who in turn are stimulated to good and positive things. So it must be absolutely certain for man that he wishes his family, his friends and acquaintances, and his entire environment, all fellow men as well as nature and its fauna and flora, only the very best. That is why it is necessary and absolutely inevitable that man works consciously and willingly, as well as very hard on himself, in order to give the whole environment, all fellow human beings, nature and its entire fauna and flora, everything they need and deserve in terms of vibration and, if possible, also acting directly. Every human being has to fight for himself first and foremost, and he must therefore also know that this is the only way he can get to know himself and learn to appreciate, support and protect his fellow human beings, nature and its fauna and flora, as well as Earth itself. But he can only do that if he is a real role model for them and for everything that exists. And if man thinks that nobody listens to him, then he must ask himself why, so that through his reflection he can find out and learn that he is committed to false actions, hopes, deeds, and behaviors that alienate him directly from his fellow human beings, nature and its fauna and flora, as well as from life. But this is the moment when man has to awaken from his self-referential and pathological self-deafness and autocracy, and fight for and for himself. He must fight to prove to all his fellow men the opposite of what he has done and behaved wrongly in everything he has done so far. This means, however, that he must fundamentally change in every respect to the good and positive, in order to be able to stand at the very top of the list with his fellow human beings. So he must consciously and willingly form the greatest motivation to do the right thing, so that he can also prove to his fellow men that he creates the seemingly impossible and lets it become reality, of which his fellow men are of the opinion with regard to him and his actions, deeds, and behaviors that he is a failure and one who never manages to become a true man, because that is impossible for him. 3. Once a person gives up something good, positive, and important, he will never get rid of his failure, so his failure will accompany him all his life, unless he has a good friend who can explain to him what he has to do for his own sake. As a rule, such a person, who fails in the manner mentioned, is not consciously self-hating in him, and from this alone, so to speak, the dissatisfaction itself. In this way, his impaired mind does not allow him to think about himself, his actions, his deeds, his thoughts and feelings, as well as his fundamentally wrong behavior, and, as a rule, obscene and vulgar ways of speaking and fluency of speech. As a result of this and due to a lack of healthy and positive thoughts and feelings, such a person radiates pathological indifference and coldness of feeling, which have a very negative and bad effect on fellow human beings, nature, and its fauna and flora. In addition, he is repulsive to his fellow human beings, bland, dull, unpleasant, 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 unfriendly, uncouth, uncouth, unattractive, even disgusting and disgusting, etc., and makes any possibility of friendship impossible from the outset. Well, another fact is that when a man gives up his dreams, and as a result of which he has fallen underground into flaming pain, as well as into self-hatred, which he vehemently denies, but nevertheless suffers greatly from, he will feel the whole of his wrong actions and behavior all his life. He will banish the effective truth about himself from his life, and always grieve in the perception that he has no real friends who stand by him. And all this only because he deceived himself in such a way that he did not use his chance to become a true and self-respecting man, which he could have created if he had not failed shamefully when he had it in his hand to win, when perhaps friends offered him the opportunity to do so. The fact is that when a person ceases to pursue good and positive dreams in life, he is only waiting to live his life right and bad, and then finally to die hoping to be released from the suffering of his existence, especially when he is also struck by the pain that makes his life his torment. This is because he never managed to bring himself, his wrong actions, his wrong deeds, and his wrong behavior under control, and consequently became sniveling, which was intensified by the fact that his fellow men showed no compassion for him because of his moral wickedness or offensiveness, his commonness, his shameful behavior, his indecency, his linguistic corruption, and his immorality. That a human being, as I have just described him, can only bring himself under a healthy and positive self-control and become a true human being through this, can only happen through external help with mind and reason is tried to teach him and bring him on the right path of life. But this is a very protracted process, which under circumstances can remain an attempt throughout one's whole life, because the stupid, audacious stubbornness and arrogant self-importance of a man who is so disturbed in understanding, reason and psychology hardly allows any or no reaction with regard to a helpful, enlightening and reasonable conversation, precisely because there is no interest on the part of the man affected by negativity and self-importance to become a fully fledged, honorable and worthy man. 4. The person who negatively exercises his thoughts, feelings, and behaviors should strive to direct his thoughts and aspirations toward what it would be like if he were successful and had a circle of friends around him who would honor him fully rather than water him. Man should never forget to have a real, good and positive dream for self-control and self-esteem and self-realization in order to be a true, honorable and worthy man who through his healthy thoughts and feelings can also perceive, experience and understand that he is a true man among his peers in his actions, deeds, and behavior. He must know that he really lives his dream and carries it into the future until his death, which he can face with honor and dignity, and say that he has lived his life in a decent, honorable, worthy, and humane way in joy, love, and contentment. 5. Man, as such, in his actions as well as in his morals, and in his behavior, and in his knowledge, should not simply be average, but should strive in every respect to always do everything to the best of his ability. In order to endure throughout life, man must be urged out of himself to do everything possible to give and do the best he can, and he must always do everything to the right to always be at the top of the level of true humanity, and to be great, and not just sometime in the future. So he must never give himself up and not simply take the path of mediocrity, but must constantly make an effort and educate himself in every possible relationship he can think of. As a result, he must also protect himself from the fear and the possibility of simply leading a normal life in a state of indifference, lack of self-control, loyalty to fate, lack of interest and humility. But he must learn to be himself all around with his own needs, interests, dreams, and desires, which he knows how to realize and fulfill through his own energy and strength, as well as through understanding and reason. All I want to say now is that all that I have now said should not be misunderstood, that it must therefore be clear to me that I do not condemn any human being, however he may be by his intellect or ignorance, and by his reason or ignorance. So I also let every human being live his own life and behave as he wants to, but I take the liberty as announcer of my mission to teach people the teaching of truth, teaching of the Spirit, teaching of life, if they are willing to hear or read it. I also take the liberty of drawing people's attention to their wrong actions, deeds, and behaviors through the instructive opinion, and of showing them the way to correct them if there is any circumstance that suggests it. It would not do me any good if I were to act in the wrong way, as it would not do that majority of earthly mankind any good to be accused of wrong actions, deeds, and behavior, because unfortunately it is poor in understanding and unreasonable, and therefore triggers and promotes murder and manslaughter and all evils, as well as wars, the death penalty, and all conceivable crimes. And if all people would cultivate their thoughts, feelings, their actions and their behavior in the way that corresponds to the creative natural laws and commandments, then vain would be peace and love, joy and harmony on earth and among all people. And I know with certainty that if mankind is honest with himself and also in a loving and peaceful way with his fellow men, nature and its fauna and flora, then for all evils there is neither a danger nor something of which he should be taught. The fact is that every human being is his own master and capable of making himself successful in every possible relationship he strives for. Unfortunately, however, there is also the ironic fact that every person can only prevent himself from something and put himself at a disadvantage, so that he then stands in his own way to the future and a better and positively fulfilled life. And it doesn't matter whether he does it on his own wrong initiative or whether other people do something about it.
Contact Report 681.
So then this is the state of affairs today, which is not exactly pleasing, but must probably be accepted and inspire us to pursue our mission even more intensively, and to teach the human beings of Earth how fundamentally wrong all religions and sects are. Unfortunately, however, it is so that the teaching of the human beings of the earth as a rule only acts like individual fertile grains, germinates, grows and grows into fruit when they are scattered, because the entire gigantic ground surface of the earth is only fertile in the tiniest places where individual tender little plants can sprout and develop. As a rule, the entire gigantic bulk of the human beings of the earth either have deaf ears as a result of indifference. Consequently, the teaching of truth, teaching of the Spirit, teaching of life, simply goes unheard as if in an endless desert, or they are so stupid that they simply live indifferently into the day. But it may also be that a bulk of the majority is megalomaniac, and so self-centered and self-important that it presumes to be more knowledgeable, more powerful, and more perfect than perfection itself. But as far as religious sectarian belief is concerned, in connection with strange and also harmful occurrences that bring some trouble, I think that human beings can also be influenced by it. What do you think, Zafenatpaniach, or you, Yanarara, who are concerned with these factors, since you have been able to analyze the religious sectarian energies, swinging waves and forces that permeate your protective shields that you have put on us, as Ta told me recently?
Contact Report 690.
I do not need to check with Yanarara on this because we have talked about this several times. According to the clarifications by Yanarara, we have become aware that these sectarian energies and their forces have an extremely intensive and aggressive effect on all believing Earth humans of all faiths and prevent them from turning to the effective truth and reality, and thus also to the teaching of truth, teaching of the Spirit, teaching of life. Consequently, only Earth humans find their way to the mission who are self-determined and very earnest and strong-willed in their search for the fundamental truth and reality, and who strive to find and fathom it. And they do this also when the whole thing is very arduous and absolutely new to them, and they have to tread a completely new path of learning, and possibly also lose acquaintances and friendships, and they encounter hostility in their own family. These sectarian energies and their forces also affect all core group members, as well as the passive members, more or less according to the certainty of the person in question regarding his certainty of the correctness and truth and of the understanding of the spiritual teaching or the teaching of truth. Teaching of the Spirit, teaching of life. In this respect, the individual member's own strength of consciousness, intellect, and reason are of great importance, for only when these are developed in a good and considerable way are they able to stand more or less strongly above the religious and sectarian norms of belief and dogmas of faith, and to think, act, and decide freely of faith, and thus also to be free in their own opinions as well as in their own thoughts, self-determinations, decisions, and in their certainty. However, as far as the sectarian religious energies and their forces are concerned, they also have a negative effect on your great mission, in such a way that in general, all religiously believing Earth humans are very strongly influenced by their faith against reality and its truth, and are subjected to defensive and narrow-minded doubts. This also involves fears and terrors that divine punishment and damnation would threaten if one were to fall away from religious sectarian faith. Earth humans are also affected by fears that they could be ridiculed in their circles of acquaintances and family, as well as in public, and that they could be disadvantaged in many ways. But this ridiculing also happens with regard to the teaching of truth, teaching of the Spirit, teaching of life itself, as well as with regard to the connections with our Pleiaren existence, which is not only called into question by know-it-alls and antagonists, but is vehemently censured and discredited, disputed and denied. And in this respect, the majority of all public and religious sectarian media, as well as their journalistic forces, also follow suit, just as religious representatives, sect leaders, and their followers act in the same way. As for your question concerning yourself, Yanarara explained that you are exposed to these religious and sectarian energies and forces to a very great extent, which I know you constantly have to resist, but which can still have a negative effect on your physical health. This, while fortunately you are not mentally or consciously, intellectually, mentally, psychically, intellectually, and rationally attackable by the swinging waves of the energies or by their strong forces, which, as I have already said, does not apply to your body.
It just is, well, that's just the way it is. I was going to talk about an article today about the U.S. secret prisons, where the prisoners are kept and tortured worse than vicious animals. But Atlantis has brought me another article which I have now written something about myself, which I will read to you and also give you some of my perspective and experience, as well as some of what I have learned from your father Svath and from you. The title of the article was, "We'll Find a Way Out," and title caption was the following: Psychiatrist Christian Peter Doggs had a horrible childhood and made it to head doctor. A conversation about good therapists, the might of feelings, and his dislike of psychoanalysis. A 240-page book about his life was also written by Dr. Doggs in collaboration with a Stern journalist called Nina Polchow. It is published by Ullstein Verlag under the title Feelings Are Not a Disease and costs €20. Can I read you my work?
Of course, because it interests me.
Good, thanks. This Mr. Doggs, as a doctor and therapist, obviously knows astonishingly well about the abysses of the human psyche from his own experience and thus from personal experience. In fact, he stated during an interview exactly what your father Svath taught me in my youth with regard to the psyche, psychology, and psychiatry. So he also said that so-called psychoanalysis is the greatest and last nonsense in terms of exploring and recognizing mental impairments, problems, damages, and illnesses, which, to my understanding, as you and your father taught me, arise in a consciousness-like form and thus through the world of thoughts and feelings. In fact, Dr. Doggs also flatly declared that the disastrously stupid psychoanalysis, which is my term for this method of treatment or psychoterror, should be abolished because it is simply idiotic. In this respect, I have also learned further important facts from you, because as a doctor, psychologist, and psychiatrist, you also represent and teach the same as your father. Now, like you and Svath and all the other medically and psychologically etc. educated Pleiaren, who do not think anything of the pathologically stupid psychoanalysis, neither do I, as I have often mentioned in all our conversations. And just as I have classified the stupid and completely wrong psychoanalyses and psychology assessments of psychiatrists and psychologists as imbecilic psychoterror since my youth, and do so again and again officially in our contact talks, so too does this psychiatrist Christian Peter Doggs in a similar way. His following words were quoted verbatim as follows: "I do not think much of psychoanalysis. Analysts are often aloof, pretend to be omniscient, and waste the time of human beings. Most of them fail to establish a bond with their patients. Psychoanalysis should be abolished. My opinion, and also that of the psychiatrist Doggs, corresponds to the fact that the effective fact of a psychoanalysis is that after years of making the analysis, nothing valuable comes out, and a psychologically demolished human being, and also the psychoanalyst, do not know in what the psychic damage is founded. As you and also your father Svath have taught me, that through a psychoterror exerted on the human being in the form of a psychoanalysis or through some other torture, the human being falls into a trauma, so the incompetent psychiatrists and psychoanalysts then call and take this trauma as the alleged reason that the patient is in a bad way psychologically and in terms of consciousness. Dr. Doggs explains that Sigmund Freud's teachings on the origins and treatment of neuroses may have been groundbreaking for medicine, but he says that this concept is outdated and that it is very cerebral to believe that a human being can be helped here and now by poking around in the past for years. And this is precisely one of the most important points that you and Svath have made in my teaching, and that I have also recognized myself in many psychologically demolished human beings, which is why I never had the crazy idea of tempting them to poke around in their past. I have also described this in my book, The Psyche, and explained that only the present and the future are important. Therefore, for example, if a leg breaks on a chair and it is taken to a cabinet maker for repair, he is not interested in how and when the chair leg broke, because his interest lies only in making a new piece of wood or turning it into shape in order to repair the chair. The same applies to the human being, because if he is psychologically demolished, then it is not important for the repair of the psychological damage to poke around in the past, but it is only important and useful to create new and healthy thoughts, and thus also new healthy feelings, which then influence the psyche in a positive way, work through the demolished state, let the psyche recover and bring about a balance appropriate to it again. The psychiatrist Dr. Doggs explained that in his 30 years as a doctor and chief physician, he had seen around 30,000 patients, and had never seen any of them get better through psychoanalysis. On the contrary, he said, psychoanalysis had made them feel much worse, because the negative evaluation pathways in the brain had become more and more entrenched due to the constant processing of difficult issues from the past. And he also said that during his training as a psychotherapist, he himself had to go through a teaching analysis, which had effectively been a horror. I can also confirm what he said about the 30,000 patients, as you know, because all those human beings whom I was able to help complained about the psychoanalyses carried out by psychoanalysts, and that they were getting worse and worse because of it. This, however, while they were much better or had no more psychological problems at all, since they followed what I taught them and what they also achieved by following the advice in my book, The Psyche. In learning from his professor, Dr. Doggs was first told that psychoanalysis was like dipping your hands in vinegar water. Before, you think you have nothing, but afterwards it burns in the places where there are injuries. And in the individual lessons he was told, Mr. Doggs, the next 50 minutes are yours. Then the professor sat at the head of the couch where I was lying, kept silent, sometimes said, and fell asleep in between. I was also mostly silent and fell asleep as well. You might as well get a bartender as a therapist. He also listens well. Dr. Doggs goes on to say that even when some studies on the efficacy of various treatments do well, he is very critical of them because, in his view, no valid studies can be done in psychotherapy. By this he means, if I define valid correctly, that no valid and reliable scientific statement can be made in a desolate or run-down, bleak and hopelessly demolished psychological state. Furthermore, I myself believe that psychoanalysis alone is completely nonsensical, because it cannot reflect the effective circumstances of life, as well as the psyche-forming thoughts and feelings of a human being, although it is precisely these factors that are of particular significance and importance, and determine the state of the psyche both positively and negatively. And so, as I learned the whole thing according to your and your father's teachings, it is clear from the article that Dr. Doggs also thinks in the same framework and understands everything, for he says with regard to psychotherapy and valid studies, they cannot reflect the patient's life circumstances, yet they have a great influence on well-being. As a young doctor, I also once thought, oh, the patient is better, I'm a great therapist. And then I found out that this patient fell in love and had sex in the clinic. That's why he was doing well. And I'm sure it was also because of his understanding fellow patients, the good conversations between them, because he felt in good hands in the clinic. But probably not because of my few individual sessions. Well, in my opinion, as I have always expressed it, the whole psychotherapy system, as it was practiced by Freud and others after him and is still practiced today, is on the one hand highly psychodestructive, and on the other hand, it is just a horrendous money-making scheme, no matter what kind of method is used. Dr. Doggs is also of this opinion, which he expresses with the following statement. Ultimately, the whole subject of psychotherapy, who is being treated there, why, with which method and for how long, is a self-preserving system. No one changes anything because everyone makes good money from it, and no therapist wants to treat only the really seriously ill. This is more exhausting than having conversations about mood disorders. Dr. Doggs goes on to say that at the beginning of his psychiatry work, he used to discharge people who were not seriously mentally ill from the clinic early, politely but firmly, telling them that they were clogging up the places in the clinic for the really sick. For example, there was a civil servant with depressive moods who wanted to be pensioned off i.e., receive a pension by Dr. Doggs, but this man was doing quite well, which he also openly admitted. Various patients, however, initiated an appeal procedure, which is why Dr. Doggs got into trouble with the health insurance companies. And he also said that if a human being had so much time for bureaucracy and the initiation of an objection procedure, he was not severely depressed. For my part, I also think this is correct, because if a human being is really severely psychologically damaged and thus severely depressed, then he or she no longer feels able to engage in bureaucratic antics and use terrorist objection procedures to win pension money. But that is exactly what is being done today by alleged borderliners, depressives and other psychosick people as well as hypochondriacs and malingerers, who are paid unjustified pensions by insurance companies because they are not recognized as work-shy and simulative actors who scam horrendous pension money at the expense of honest insurance payers. Being mentally ill is the big trend today in order to cheat pension money by playing sick, because it is very easy to pretend to be mentally ill to doctors, psychologists and psychiatrists, which is widely used by work-shy people and malingerers, who use it to rob the health insurance funds and pension insurance companies. Today, Dr. Doggs is so far gone that he treats so-called hardcore cases in his private clinic free of charge, such as a borderline patient who injured herself and climbed electricity pylons. Borderline disorder, if I want to explain it, corresponds to a severe mental illness in which there is typical impulsivity, as well as unstable interpersonal relationships, rapid mood changes, and a very fluctuating self-image. In order to recognize a really genuine and good psychotherapist, as I learned from your father and you, and also experienced and learned myself, it is indispensable to be able to establish a mutual, human, stable bond of trust If this is not possible with a therapist, then any therapy, etc., is useless and pointless from the outset. But in order to be able to recognize whether it is possible to build up a necessary bond of trust and to let it develop, and also in every other form with regard to a confidential bond with one or more fellow human beings, especially with regard to an open, honest, good and positive interpersonal relationship, this can only be done by first spending a few hours during which relevant conversations are held with the other person. In the case of illness, the therapist. Dr. Doggs also works within this framework, as you and your father Svath taught me, and as I have always adhered to, about which he says the following with regard to recognizing a good therapist. The chemistry has to be right. You can tell pretty quickly if you have a connection with someone. First, arrange 1 or 2 trial sessions to find out if you can build a bond. This is successful if the therapist is open, authentic, warm-hearted. If he has a sense of humor and also reveals something about himself. In 1994, at the Panorama Fachklinik in Scheidegg in the Allgäu, which I ran for many years, we were the only clinic in Germany to offer a free choice of therapist. The patient did not go to a therapist who was assigned to him because he just had time, but to the one he had chosen. There were colleagues to whom no one wanted to go. As their boss, I told them, "You cannot build up a bond. You'd better become an anesthetist or a surgeon." My experience of being genuinely helpful with people who had some kind of psychological problems or damage, as you know, was that I never saw those who came to me for help as sick people, but as human beings, and I also treated them as such, always letting them live out their thoughts and feelings openly and uninhibitedly, as Svath had already taught me in the later 1940s, when I was only 12 years old. Your father always said that I should make it clear to psychologically suffering human beings that they should not repress the thoughts and feelings that torment them and negatively affect the psyche, but should resolve them with good, healthy, and positive ones. Basically, he always said, I had to make it clear to psychologically suffering human beings that tormenting thoughts and fears, anger and feelings as well as sadness, also belong to them and were their very own property of consciousness, which they had to accept but bring under control, whereby one of the best ways to do this was to dissolve them through good, positive, and neutral thoughts and feelings. And indeed this method, which I also described in my book, The Psyche, has worked excellently with all those human beings who sought help from me for their psychological problems and also followed my advice. And this was also the case when psychosomatic problems already appeared, and physical illnesses already effectively appeared. Effectively, a psychologically suffering human being must be made to understand, whereby, as a rule, the majority of purely physically ill people, or those suffering from the consequences of accidents already, have problems that place a psychological burden on them, that the whole of his condition is the way it is, and that he is therefore also allowed to be the way he is as a whole, and that he is allowed to accept this, although he must make an effort to bring his negative thoughts and feelings under control, without compulsion through new, good, and positive ones. But this can only happen in a valuable way if, on the one hand, the human being distances himself from the past and its conflicts, faces the present, and begins to live into it. This means that the human being, who is more or less or even severely psychologically distressed, does not rummage around in evil and negative events of the past, but lets them rest mentally, emotionally, and thus dissolves them by cultivating new, healthy, positive, and valuable future-oriented thoughts and feelings. Digging around in the old and past evil and negative experiences, happenings and events as dull, recalls everything painfully over and over again, and whips everything up to wild heights anew instead of settling down, calming the thoughts and feelings and dissolving what is psychologically ill. And this is also true in the relationship, if there are any conflicts of the present that the human being has to consciously face and work through, no matter what the conflict factors are. By the very fact that the human being becomes aware of his problems, which arise from arguments, tensions, quarrels, disagreements, mental upsets, from discords or any disharmonies, or as a result of controversies, a fight or war, etc., and faces them by considering their nature and seeing and recognizing them in the effective way, he already reduces their energy and power. This is then also the time to face the whole problem with a new, healthy, positive, and valuable thinking, which then also forms correspondingly similar feelings that have a beneficial influence on the psyche. Focusing on new good, positive, healthy, and valuable thoughts in every respect, no matter what they are directed towards, dissolves the thought-feeling deficits and problems that influence the psyche in a negative way, damaging it and making it ill. If this focusing on a new thought-feeling world is taken up and cultivated, and for this also invested in the repetition and repetition and repetition and repetition, then there is no need to search particularly and laboriously for any cure for the sick psyche condition, because solely through the willful cultivation of new, healthy, positive, correct, and valuable thoughts and feelings, the psyche is cured of its damage or its sickness. Therefore, it is not necessary to look specifically for happiness and contentment, because these two values arise independently if good, positive, healthy, and valuable thoughts and feelings are cultivated again and again, through which all burdensome conflicts and problems, etc., are dissolved and become void. Fundamentally, a good, healthy, positive, and valuable world of thoughts and feelings is the crucial point for a healthy psyche. But in order to cultivate the world of thoughts and feelings, the human being must learn to actually do this. It is also necessary, as I have also described in my book, The Psyche, for the human being to get up and move about in the open air again and again, roaming through meadows, fields, and forests, whereby gymnastics, cycling, sport, swimming, or other forms of movement are also very important. Must hours for the thoughts and feelings must also be observed, in order to shield these and thereby also the consciousness and the brain from the effects of stimuli, for these also require rest, as is the case for the body itself.
Contact Report 692 Prediction of Great-Great-Grandfather Hylac from 1446b. Emmanuel, Chr.
The life of the human beings in the world will degenerate over thousands of years into the distant future of modern times, and for a very long time thereafter, through delusion in deities and the like, into a wretched, unpleasant, and degenerate life in false slavery to faith corrupted by faith. A serious imprisonment in a delusion arises, which for thousands of years leads to strife and terrible wars, and again to new perditions. Faith-based deceptions of the senses, dazzling works, conceits, misleadings, lies and deceit, mystifications, illusions and pretenses of phantasmagoria will be part of the order of all times to come, and will claim many thousands of human lives, and again destroy large parts of the world and its nature by wars, etc., many thousands of lives. And the origin of this disaster will begin in about 200 years with the coming of the Yisajor Covenant note, Ptah, monotheistic delusional tribe in Canaan, later Syria, actual origin of Judaism, of the first world-encompassing delusion, which will be carried far into the distant future by wars, hatred, envy, retaliation, and lies and deceit for thousands of years. This first delusion, which will be called Creed Note Ptah, religion in the distant future, will then bring much misery, envy, distress, suffering, delusion, hatred, and destruction between all the peoples of the world for millennia. From the Delusionary Alliance Note Ptah, community of faith, association of faith, unification of faith, that will be set in motion and set in motion by the first one. The actual origin of the greatest delusionary evils of the world will emerge. From this origin in another 700 years or so, another delusion will arise in the east of the world, through which bloodshed and hatred will also be spread over the world in the course of time. Another 500 years or so later, a herald Emmanuel of the old teaching of the prophets will appear, whose teaching, however, will be falsified, misused, and from it a new delusion will be derived that is extremely slanderous, corrupting, spreading hatred, dangerous, death-poisoning, and destructive worldwide. This will lead for more than 2 millennia to worldwide wars, war crimes, murders, hatred, persecutions, and immense destruction of countless human works, nature, and its creatures. This will also involve an immense number of human beings who will multiply like locusts and devise and carry out machinations whose malignant effectiveness will destroy large parts of the planet and nature, causing much of nature's life to become extinct for all time. But some 500 years after the appearance of the messenger of the teaching of the prophets, a new messenger note Ptah, Muhammad, will come into existence in the revival of the same teaching to eradicate all that is false and reprehensible, but which malicious and delusional believers and those who misunderstand the teaching will have slanderously made of the teaching of the prophet of the previous messenger. But also, the teachings of this new messenger will be extremely maliciously falsified and will cause wars, hatred, slander, and innumerable deaths throughout the next millennia, as well as fear, horror, and comprehensively deadly acts of violence. Note Ptah, tyranny. Ptah, tyranny, despotism, dictatorship, reign of terror, totalitarian systems, absolutist rule and terrorism, which will bring riots, unrest, violence, riots, street fights, tumults, insurrections, and assaults. Therefore, through clarity and reason, the human beings of modern times must learn to understand their situation leading into the abyss and free themselves from their false beliefs, find the way to themselves, become themselves, and consciously learn to bear their own responsibility. Let it therefore be said to all mankind that they must leave their prison of faith and their delusion of faith, for otherwise great masses will be led astray by their faith in God, and a multitude in millions will be tortured and murdered by degenerating persecutions of faith when the sun cross note. Ptah, sun wheel. Swastika, swastika, as an evil sign announces the approaching time of terror, and the energy of the tiniest note, nuclear fission, is released, misused, and becomes a destructive messenger of death. And if it happens, then it is also announced with it that all horrors will be more and more frequent in succession, whereby many sufferings will arise, and only a small part will be capable of non-belief reason, to whom alone the truth will be recognizable and comprehensible, whereby also only a few will be wise enough to be able to find their actual happiness with knowledge. Everything around the human being will collapse and disappear, and nothing of the achievements of civilization will retain its existence. For the perversity of human beings will destroy everything, for it will shake the whole earth, and in the end, no traces of the erroneous cults will survive. The great mass of many billions of human beings will degenerate under the yoke of ignorance and God-belief and will become alien to true life in a creative way and degenerate in every conceivable way. There will also be severe earthquakes as earth mechanical natural phenomena, tremendous violent storms, and unimagined conflagrations that will change the face of the earthly world. But the warnings will not be heeded, just as the old teaching of the prophets will not be heeded, which the new herald of modern times will bring, and which will have the aim of awakening and sensitizing the intellect and reason of human beings, in order to enable them to free themselves from their errors and the delusion of their religious faith and from its follies, as well as from all their evil actions, deeds, and crimes of all kinds. But nevertheless, they shall be taught by the new herald and learn to understand that they alone are responsible for all their actions, deeds, and conduct, as are also other intelligent life forms in the universe. The human beings should and must strive to be in harmony with the currents of nature and the universe, and thus with creation and all its continuance, and not refuse to go with the creative flow, lest they miss the benefits of the good conditions offered to them by the precepts of creation, which can be developed higher and higher by the intelligence and power of human beings themselves. But they must develop the evolution of their consciousness in order not to be left behind in their intellect and reason, in order not to have to wait millions of years for a foreign might to help them to an ascending wave of intellect and reason. The Earth and the whole solar system, as well as the universe as a whole, were not created by a cheap and inexistent deity, but as the only creation by an immense outpouring of natural consequential creative natural impulses and brought into an evolving direction. These creative natural impulses, which also work in human beings, are called love for the sake of understanding in a human sense, but are disregarded by countless human beings, regarded as sentimentality, and, in spite of their great power, judged to be ridiculous. In fact, however, these impulses, which are called love, are the most magnificent of all the forces existing in human beings, beside which money and might are but trifling unvalues, and this also when human beings depend upon them decisively for the course and preservation of their lives. In the future, however, human beings must be particularly flooded with love and serve it, for otherwise their lives and consciousness will be tortured and damaged by unimaginable sufferings, difficulties, and inhuman deeds and horrors, as a result of which their mental order, thoughts, thinking, and behavior will become evil, criminal, sacrilegious, reprehensible, primitive, and prole. So then, the terrible forms of the prophecies of the ancient prophets will be fulfilled, relating to the coming epoch, which will soon begin and be fulfilled, but will continue in a vicious and terrifying manner from the sign of the Sun cross onwards, and will move continuously into the future. The times of great floods will also come upon the world, and where the earth is, there will be water, and where there is water, there will be earth. Hurricanes, gigantic fires, and earthquakes will rain and sweep away everything, as through horror, wars, murders, revolutions, tyranny, dictatorship, totalitarianism, tyranny, arbitrary rule, unlimited gay vault and crime, an incredible amount of human blood will flow. Terrible explosions will be heard in many places on Earth, as a result of explosion attacks and terrorist attacks, causing fear, horror, dread, and terror in many places and countries. And in many cases, the false and insane faith in God will be to blame for this, and it will always be a delusion of human beings, but never an answer or a demand of a God invented by human beings. On the contrary, nature will demand retribution for the crimes committed and perpetrated against it and against the earth by mankind, which is overflowing in its multitude. Let human beings be advised to practice peace, to live in peace, and to rule the world in peace before the time of suffering and terror comes. For it has been written since time immemorial that not a single hair of the righteous will be harmed. So may the righteous human beings not be discouraged, but simply follow the path of learning for the personal advancement of their consciousness, as the old true prophets taught, and as the new herald will teach in the modern age, and his teaching will also be carried out into the space of the world. The human beings must study his teaching and learn how the universe and thus the creation works, for it is necessary for them to learn to understand the world and the creation as nature and universe very quickly, and in this way to merge with it in knowledge. The human beings are predestined to learn in order to live in a way that is in harmony with nature and creation, just as every individual is capable of striving for and living according to the laws of creation. But for this, each one must form himself like a new continent, and emerge like an island from the vast sea, and spread out in his love and knowledge to the best of his own ability. In the new time, the new proclaimer will be the founder of a new civilization, note Ptah, grouping, association, which will also be called a community, and which will undeterredly take a stand for the good and the right, and for the old teaching of the prophets, note Ptah, teaching of the truth, teaching of the Spirit, teaching of the life. It will spread the old teaching of the prophets through a new form and represent it to the human beings throughout the world. Through this, in time, the humanity of Earth will form a great family which will eventually be like a great and extensive body. In the new civilization, note Ptah, grouping, community, association, love will manifest in a way that will be exemplified by the herald in a simple and unifying way. Unfortunately, however, the Earth will remain a planet of struggle, toil, misery, and hardship, even though in modern times the teaching of the new messenger will gradually be spread throughout the earth by new modern ways and means. The forces of evil and darkness will probably feel oppressed and slowly withdraw, but the earth and its humanity will never be finally liberated from them. Many human beings following the teaching of the Annunciator will walk a new, better and clearer path, a path of new life, which will lead to the development of consciousness, to understanding and reason, to inner peace, to inner freedom and joy of life, and to true human beinghood. Others, however, the unrighteous and degenerate, in their senseless pride and unruliness, will continue to lead their lives in a nefarious manner, condemning all that is creative and lacking in understanding. In the end, however, they will have to come to understand that their old direction of life is completely wrong and no longer compatible with the new world which will be created by the new teaching, and from which a new culture and civilization will awaken. It will then only be a matter of time when the light of truth, goodness, and justice will awaken and triumph. Religions will lose their power, and truth will have to take its rightful place when the common basis of all God belief systems collapses. As a result, bad human beings will slowly give up the intensity of their evil beliefs and turn to the peacefulness of truth and to their fellow human beings. But many of them will also hate the new herald of the modern age, and they will viciously injure his honor with hostile insults and false accusations, words of lies, and malicious slander invented in anger. And shame will be done to his reputation and sinister plots. Note tar, injustices, assassinations, assaults will be perpetrated against him. Also, through hateful followers of the faith, there will also be deliberate attempts to despicably and cunningly destroy his commitment and work with many new tools of modern times. Note, PTA, information possibilities, internet, media, radio, television. But all those who attack will harm themselves, for their lives will be joyless, and they themselves will be hated by their fellow human beings, because they will not accept the new life with regard to the old teachings of the prophets. Consequently, they will perish in their lives like rotten, harmful fruit. But it will also be on earth that certain continents will perish and others will emerge, because not only the human beings, but also the face of the world will change completely. And there will be many dangers in the future millennia of which mankind is not yet aware, and which will bring them much suffering, hardship, misery, wars, damage, and destruction. Also, many human beings will continue for a long time to pursue dishonorable, unworthy, impure, dangerous goals that will ultimately doom them to failure. And this will be so while the others, who respectfully learn and obey the teachings of the new announcer of the modern age, will deal honorably with their lives and with all things. Thanks to the teaching of the prophets of old, the earth will one day become a blessed planet. But until then, humanity will still be hit by a great deal of suffering, misery, and hardship, and its consciousness will not yet be awakened. So it will still take centuries and millennia until everything is fulfilled in such a way that the teaching of the ancient prophets becomes the true teaching of life for all mankind. So it must still prepare itself for great and severe trials and overcome them, for it cannot avoid them and must learn to master them, whether it likes it or not, otherwise it will perish one day.